And we'll go through just a couple more examples on the list that is not the specifics, but the more contemplative. So I learned, because it was contemplative, that because we have two worlds, we also have two kinds of poverty. So there's the poverty we always had, which is I don't have enough essentially to live. And then there's this new poverty that civilization kicked off, which is having enough and not knowing it. So when I was producing Swaparama, I had a volunteer who produced an event for me in the Midwest. And she called and she said, I got this great team of volunteers, artists and interesting people. And then there's this one woman on my team who really is pretty well off. She's got like a really fancy car, and she said, this woman wants to get paid. So, volunteerism, if you define it, actually includes that you don't get paid. So we weren't hasty with our answer. We thought about it for a while, and we realized that this was her kind of poverty. She was expert at asking the world for what it would never give her. So all she got back was this affirmation, right, the world's not abundant. There's not enough, there's not enough, there's not enough. So we were like, well, let's just tell her what she needs to hear. So we were like, yeah, we'll pay you. And we gave her a little more than she asked for. And she was the only one who got paid because actually she was the only one who needed to get paid. She was the impoverished one. So, so there's a modern form of poverty, which is having enough and not knowing you have enough. I learned that civilization isn't natural. So when we have a natural response to this artificial system, so that might look like depression or feeling isolated or disconnected or just sad and confused. When we have that natural reaction, we call it something and then prescribe something. So what we're missing is the civilization is lifeless. The Sufis say only life lives, death dies, right? The economic system never had any life. I do, right? Civilization has no life. I made it. We made it. So when we have a natural reaction to an artificial system, we really ought to be honoring the common sense, which is giving its feedback and expressing what's wrong with the artificial system. I was really hung up on value for like years. just could not stop thinking about it because actually I couldn't find it. And that was my issue. So in New York City, occasionally we have sanitation strikes. And when we do, the piles of black plastic garbage bags are like this high. And when you walk down the streets, it's like a weird maze. It's really kind of like sci-fi-ish. And if you rip open those bags, what you'll find in them is pretty new consumer goods, useful electronics, clothes that aren't ruined, stuff that's pretty new. And I kept looking at this stuff and saying, I know that people work really hard to get that money to buy that stuff. So why are they pushing it to the curb so fast? And what I suspect is happening is we know on some level that this stuff comes at the cost of the diminishment of life, which is our own life. So there's shame embedded in these goods. So we buy it because we want to fill up and we have an appetite that can't be satisfied this way. But then once we have it, we push it to the curb really, really fast. When I see people at Swaparama take used clothes, and rip them to bits and then re-sew them into something else and then silk screen on them and do all these things and have fun with their friends and hold these garments up at the end of the day, I can see that these garments are going to be passed on to grandchildren. They started off as waste. And the only measurable difference between this and what fills the garbage bags during the strike is that one got touched by life and one didn't. It came off a dead machine in a system. So I wound up concluding that I did figure out what value is, and I think value is responsibility. And if you notice, you can't buy it anywhere. So I think as the first generation alive to see the whole world for sale, which is us, what we're really being asked is, what are we? What is human nature? That's the question that's being thrown around. And we have to answer. So are we limited and mechanistic? Are we consumers? Or are we unbounded and creative? Are we creators? And I think we know the answer. So I'm going to end with just two things. One is probably the most valuable lesson of anything I learned, and then the other is the only promise I can make to you in a world that is pretty thin on promises. So the best lesson I learned is you have to start if you don't know how, and you have to start if you don't know how constantly. So for 6 years, everything I did was I didn't know how to do. You know, my mom growing up, I was raised in Long Island, so I was basically like born to shop. That's what we did in Long Island. And my mom, the only time she ever said, "You've achieved something," was when I left a store with a bag. You achieved something. So, yeah. So when we move from a culture of consumption to one of something else, when we start to take our own domesticity back and become makers, we have to start everything when we don't know how, and then we have to do it again, and then we have to do it again. One of the beautiful things is when you work out of the waste stream, everything you're using as a raw material was already headed to the trash. There's absolutely no cost to make a mistake. So, and it's free and abundant and everywhere. So then the promise, and this will be the end of my talk, the only promise I could make is that if you do, you will discover that you are more than you thought yourself to be. So, that's the end of my talk.